I've talked about Morrowind, I've talked about Oblivion, and I've even talked about games outside the Elder Scrolls franchise. But now it's time to ask the question, what is it I love about Skyrim? It will come as no surprise to find out that one of the things I loved in Skyrim was Skyrim itself. The world, the land, the locations you discover, the places you visit. It was just incredible. From the moment I discovered Riverwood after leaving Helgen to pretty much the end of the game, I was constantly finding new places. I was constantly having this urge to just peek over the next mountain or through the next forest and discover what waited for me there. The land of Skyrim wasn't as alien and unique as, say, Morrowind. Indeed, for someone like me living here in Norway, it was actually quite recognisable. I saw a lot of places that could have existed here in Norway. But it was still an incredible place to explore. There were massive mountain ranges filled with snow. There were deep forests. There were strange rocky areas. I loved cities like Markarth. I thought it was an incredible place. And just so many other areas that I loved to visit. The first time you climb the steps up to talk to the Greybeards, it was such an epic experience climbing that mountain. It really did feel like something out of a fantasy movie. It's safe to say that the land of Skyrim itself is something I'm going to remember for a long, long time. Something else I loved in Skyrim was the music. Now, I always mention this in these games because I do like the music in Elder Scrolls games. Indeed, I like the music in all of the Bethesda Gaming Studio games. I think Skyrim has a special place in my heart because of the main theme. There's something truly epic about it. It isn't just great music. There's something phenomenally uplifting about it. It kind of makes you want to dive out of your chair and start wielding a sword in real life, and there's something that really appeals to me in that music, and I can never get it out of my head. More than any of the previous Elder Scrolls games, even though, I still remember the Morrowind music and I still get chills down my spine, the main theme to Skyrim just It makes my stomach lift and makes me want to, as I said, dive around like a young kid pretending to actually be the Dragonborn. But it was also the ambient music. It really did suit the game very well, as it does in all of the Elder Scrolls games, and sometimes there were definite hints of the previous games. You could hear a piece of music that would remind you of Morrowind. I can't really listen to the Skyrim soundtrack without imagining the land itself, which is a really good sign. It means the two, the sound and the visuals, mixed together to create a very lasting memory in my head. Overall, I have to say, the Skyrim soundtrack was spot on for that game. The next thing that stands out to me about Skyrim in some ways is the main quest. Ordinarily, that's not an important thing for me in in Elder Scrolls games or even Bethesda games in general. However, I felt in Skyrim it was done in a really, non-invasive way. I loved the idea of being the Dragonborn. I loved the idea of having these special shouts, and I liked the way they introduced the main quest and then release you and let you just run off and do your own thing. This is a big thing for me in Elder Scrolls games, the idea that I can do whatever I want. But they actually made the main quest something I kind of wanted to do at least a little at the start, to go and talk to the Greybeards and find out what was so special about me. But then the game kind of encourages you to go out and find all the different dragon words, all the different walls, and improve your shouts. And that gives you even more reason to just go out there into the land of Skyrim and explore. which is brilliant because, of course, deep down, that's what many of us just want to do. We don't want to be pushed around and made to do the main quest. We want a main quest that's interesting, which it was, but we want it to allow us to write our own story, to experience the game the way we want to experience it. And I think Skyrim did that very, very well indeed. I actually think not since Morrowind have they done such a good job of making a main quest that really did mean something and yet allowed you a lot of freedom. Even Oblivion, which was kind of a cool story, made you feel a little guilty in a way. Yes, you could run off and do your own thing, but you did know there was something fairly important going on and you were just kind of ignoring it. In Skyrim, you needed to prepare yourself. You needed to find these dragon words, and of course they were all over the land, and therefore you just had the excuse you needed to go off and loot every single cavern you could find. I think this is actually going to be something that becomes quite important when I discuss the Elder Scrolls formula itself. The idea that the game doesn't make me feel guilty for doing the things the game makes me want to do, because that's the problem, isn't it? You've got a story, you've got a quest you know the character should be engaged in, and yet the game itself might be giving you little treats, little temptations all along the way, and you don't want to resist them. As a gamer, you want to go off and explore every single castle, every single dungeon, but as a character you would probably want to focus on the main quest. In Skyrim, they gave you the perfect excuse to just go with it. Now, the next thing I love about Skyrim is something that's going to be controversial. It's going to have a lot of people screaming and typing horrible things at me, but it's the factions. I actually really liked the way Skyrim handled what in previous Elder Scrolls games would have been traditionally the Fighters Guild, Mages Guild, Assassins Guild, Thieves Guild, and so on. In Skyrim, there was only one real guild, and that was the Thieves Guild. There was a College of Winterhold, there were the Companions, and there was the Dark Brotherhood, and they were all extremely different. And more importantly, they let you know about those differences. The Companions made you feel like you should be a little more honourable. Joining the Thieves Guild, they made you do some very questionable things. It wasn't this sort of steal from the rich and give to the poor sort of thing. It was go round and threaten to break the shopkeepers' faces unless they paid protection money. It was really good Thieves Guild quests, but I do remember the first character I played, I was planning on having sort of fighter, thief, mage type playthrough. And I remember joining the Companions and really liking the kind of sense of honour that they had. And then joining the Thieves Guild and feeling really guilty about the things I was kind of doing. And then just sort of drifting away. I ended up not finishing that playthrough actually. It always felt wrong. And then I went back and did far more focused playthroughs where I really got into each and every, for the want of a better word, guild or faction. I actually really loved the Companion questline. I just wish it had been a lot longer. I felt that it was very, very rushed actually, and I suspect at one point it had involved a lot more quests before you became as trusted as you did, but ignoring that, I actually think the general questline was really good. I think it had a very, very good emotional tug. It really made you feel for these characters. The same is true of the Brotherhood, not quite emotional in the same way, but it was a very, very dark series of quests, and it felt massively different to every other faction out there. I really did enjoy the Civil War line as well. I liked the fact that there were two factions there where you had to choose a side. You couldn't be in both factions, you couldn't complete both sides, so to speak. This is something I really liked. Not since Morrowind do I remember Elder Scrolls having that kind of concept. And even in Morrowind, it was the three great houses. And whilst they had three different lines, which was great, they were never in direct conflict with each other the way you would end up in direct conflict in Skyrim. I really did like the idea that you had to do at least 2 playthroughs to really feel like you'd actually completed the game. The Civil War wasn't just a side faction thing where, you might think to yourself, I'd like to do all of them one day. The Civil War line really was one of those where you just had to finish it both ways to know what happened, because it reshapes the land. I loved the addition of perks in Skyrim. Now, the character system itself was a bit controversial because they did drop statistics such as strength, intelligence and endurance, and generally I'm not a lover of dropping things like that. I love having a lot more control over my character. However, I also accept that the system they used in Oblivion and Morrowind was kind of annoying. It was very clumsily done, and it was one of the first things I would modify when playing those games. I really hated the fact that it encouraged you to sort of macro manage your skills in such a way to make sure that you got the maximum magic pool, for example, or the maximum health. If you were going for a character that was a very tough, unarmored warrior, a Conan the Barbarian type, but you wanted the maximum health because that was the character you were going for, you had to macro manage the skills a little more than I was comfortable to get it to work. I do remember getting the message to level up and having to run out into the wilderness with a mace or something and just hitting a rat until I got the required skill. Then I could go to sleep safe in the knowledge that I could do the character I wanted to do. So I get it. I do get it. That side of things was a little clumsy. I think they could have changed it without removing it. However, what they replaced stats with was perks, and I actually think the perks gave more than the stats did, because the perks really did differentiate between different characters. What I mean by that is you could have a character that was 100 in heavy armor and he would be different to another character in 100 heavy armor. For example, I had a heavy armored sorcerer, and obviously his heavy armor skill would rise up and he would become an expert in heavy armor. However, there could also be another character that was a heavily armored warrior, and he did the same. He gets his armor skill up to 100, but he spends some of his perks in heavy armor, where my mage spends his perks in mage skills. And even though their armor skill is identical, the warrior is much better in the heavy armor. He has specialized at it. It has made him different. And this is really important for skills that, let's face it, all of us use. Pick locks, for example. We all pick locks pretty much non-stop. The pick lock skill is going to rise, and thus, without perks, there would be nothing to differentiate a master thief in the lock-picking department from just an amateur adventurer who happened to pick locks. But with perks, you got that. So I was a big lover of the addition of perks. I loved crafting, smithing in Skyrim, as well as alchemy and enchanting, to be honest. I love the idea of making your own things, improving your own armor. Of course, those particular fields were a little easy to abuse. If you really wanted to go overboard, you could become insanely overpowered using those 3 skills. But it's a single player game, and I'm pretty much okay with that. But that leads on to the spell system in Skyrim, which was a bit of a mixed bag. Now again, I'm focusing on things that I love, so I don't want to generally focus on things that were negative about Skyrim in this video. I am going to say something that again is going to be controversial, because one of the things I loved in Skyrim was the spell casting system. But I'm needing to differentiate that from the spell system itself. And the reason I've sort of transitioned to this from the subject of crafting is because, of course, in previous Elder Scrolls games, there was a spell crafting system as well, and that had gone in Skyrim, and I'm not saying I loved that. Again, I want to focus on the things I loved about Skyrim. So I'm not talking about the spells or the spell making system that had gone. I'm talking about the fact that you could cast spells from different hands. I loved that. I loved the idea that you could have a spell in one hand and a weapon in the other. I love the idea that you can have two spells in different hands, or the same spell and combine them into one super powerful spell. I even loved the idea that powers were used without the hands, using your voice for example, so you could actually have two weapons and still use a spell power. I liked that. I felt it was a lot more fun to use spells, to use sorcerer type spells, fireballs and that sort of thing in Skyrim than previous games. Skyrim also had a follower system that I really did like. It felt more like the follower system in Fallout 3 than, say, Oblivion. The followers seem to have their own personalities, their own characters, sometimes their own quests, in fact very often their own quests if you didn't just hire them, and I just enjoyed their company. They felt like really good additions to the team, for want of a better word. It was fun to play Skyrim with followers. And I'm not just saying that because of course they can carry your burdens. They can also fight for you as well, but more than that, they actually add some character, often some comedy, and a feeling of companionship on your journey. I really was a bit of a latecomer to using followers in games like Skyrim. In fact, only really started it when I started doing Let's Plays, and I'm really glad I did, because my Skyrim experience was so much more intense because I felt like I had a friend along for the ride. And finally, the thing I love about Skyrim that may well be the most important thing for me personally, and that is mods. The mods for Skyrim have been nothing short of incredible. There have been mods that change the way you play the game, changed the look of the game, and even changed the game. Complete overhaul mods. The amount of modding that went on was incredible, and I think Bethesda got it absolutely perfect when they released the creation kit early. They released it after about 6 weeks, and I think that was the right thing to do. In fact, they could have released it earlier. As I said, Fallout New Vegas had the GECK pretty much at release, and I really think that helped keep interest in the game going, because of course by the time people have finished their first or second playthrough, there are a lot of mods already out so they can try a modded playthrough. And the same was pretty much true for Skyrim. People would do 3 or 4 playthroughs and then they would notice new mods coming out and think, oh, I'm going to try that. That will make the game harder or more interesting or just different. And the mods were already pretty mature when they started that. Getting mods and modding support out very early, I think, was one of the key successes for Skyrim. You think about all the great mods you had installed in Skyrim before the first DLC was even announced. I had done several modded playthroughs before the first DLC came out, and honestly, I think that was part of the reason my passion for Skyrim was still there when the DLC came out. In many ways, the Skyrim modding scene really was the perfect mix. We'd had quite a few modding teams form for Fallout New Vegas, and a few of them just basically moved over to Skyrim and started some fairly big projects. Mod makers were getting used to using a lot of the different social media, a lot of the different internet communication methods to coordinate with each other and indeed to inform the people out there of what was coming. And so the modding scene really began to become a very cohesive unit. We saw the rise of YouTube being very important to modding via tutorials or showcase videos. This is something that had happened in Fallout New Vegas and indeed probably was growing, but exploded when Skyrim hit the scene. And even to this day, some 5 years after the release of Skyrim, the modding scene is still going strong, and I'm totally convinced that any success that Skyrim Special Edition, which has just been released, any success that particular version of this game has is in no small part to the fact that the modding community is so active and people are looking forward to coming back, trying even more mods on an even more stable version of the game, and indeed for console users the first chance they've ever had to play the modded game. I think Skyrim owes modding a bit of a debt of gratitude. The modding community has done an awful lot to keep Skyrim front and center, to keep it relevant even after half a decade. There is a very good chance that Skyrim will still be going strong, still getting mods and still being played by a lot of people when the next Elder Scrolls is released. And indeed, the million-dollar question of course is, what should the next Elder Scrolls game contain? Not just what should be added, but what does it need to keep from the previous games to make it the massive success that Skyrim has been. And so that is what I'm going to do in the next video. I'm going to ask, what is it that actually makes up the Elder Scrolls formula for me? What things does the next Elder Scrolls game need for me to love it as much as I've loved all of their other games? Dragons! I forgot dragons! How did I forget dragons? Dragons are cool. I loved dragons. Who doesn't love dragons?